Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by Ian C. Esslemont. Hello, Cameron.
Hello.
And Steven Erikson. Hello, Steve.
Hi. Well, at least you're not bare-chested like you were before the camera went on. I mean, I know it's hot there, but it's ridiculous.
I'm still haunted.
Yeah.
Why am I friends with you people? Why? Why? But we are meant to be talking about prose within fiction, because quite often when we are talking about books and we go, oh I really like the prose here. We use it as a very general catch-all term because prose, verse, drama. We distinguish between those genres. So we talk about prose. And what we mean when we're talking about it is generally the words on the page. But with the discourse on it, quite often we lack the different terms and the concepts that are actually behind it. And we're more almost referring to the style in which something is written rather than what the prose actually is, what the prose is doing on the page and how it is doing it. So I thought we could have a chat about this.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned prose within fiction. Isn't it actually fiction within prose in a lot of ways? Because, I mean, prose is basically anything that's not poetry, not song lyrics, not drama, not film scripts, and not shopping lists. So,
and non-fiction is a far bigger, larger genre than fiction. So.
Yeah. Yeah, so prose is kind of a generic kind of almost catch-all. And I think, what I've seen people talking about prose, good prose, bad prose, all that kind of stuff, they're actually, I think, discussing style more than they are discussing prose. It's almost impossible to discuss prose, at that level. You identify it and then where do you go from there? So
it's a vehicle, it's a mechanism, prose itself, right? And you can describe its component parts, but then when you go anywhere, I agree, if you go anywhere beyond that, you're actually getting into style, which is the deployment of these components.
Because for me, the prose on the page is very much how a narrative is communicated in literature. And so for me, obviously, what those words on the page, the order of the words on the page, the structure of sentences and paragraphs and scenes, all of that is part of what prose is on the page. And it's how a narrative is communicated to me as a reader. So for me, obviously, discussing aspects of the prose is very, very important. And yet, frequently when we talk about this, we end up with labels like purple prose. And it's, purple prose is bad. Well, purple prose in and of itself is not bad. That's a style of prose. And it's always contingent on how it is being deployed, whether the author is deploying it intentionally, if it is appropriate to be deployed in that place, what effect it is causing in the reader, or what effect it causes in terms of interpretation of what is on the page. And all those things go together in lockstep with character and characterization and narrative event and story and plot and theme and atmosphere, that while we like to isolate something and go, oh, the characterization, I'll give it 7 out of 10. Characterization is so heavily dependent on how it is done, and how it is done is heavily dependent on the language on the page, and the language on the page is going to be dependent on, and everything is interrelated. And so there's always a tension between trying to discuss something as a discrete element and a recognition that it is actually tied into all of the other aspects of what is happening in the complex engine of what is narrative.
Cam?
All these component parts, they work together. And of course, that's the artistry, right? And you are looking at how they're all working together and the effect that they are combining and building and to achieve. What's the purpose of this deployment here? What's the purpose of using purple prose here or not using it there? And is it being done to achieve a certain deliberate effect?
Yeah. I mean, narrative stance would be possibly another term we could use, another phrase. So if you were to write, what if you wrote a character who, in terms of their internal monologue, was extremely melodramatic, and so you fall into the voice of that character, and it produces purple prose, because that's basically what the way that character sees the world. And so your narrative stance can be ironic in approaching that particular section of what it is you're writing. And it can be quite deliberately overblown, because that's how the character, interacts and engages with the world in this, overblown fashion. Does that make the writing bad? Or does that make the prose bad? No, it's more a case of this is tied into the voice of that particular character and that point of view that you're using. So to me, I still go back to style. I think a lot of discussions on prose is actually discussing style.
Yeah. Well, because even with that example of, say, a character that is melodramatic, depending on the narrative stance on it, where the narrative is making fun of that character for being melodramatic, the narrative is presenting that as fact and or presenting it as we should empathize with this character. The same passage of internal monologue, depending on perspective and how it is being told to the reader and how the reader is meant to think and feel about it, can radically change the interpretation of that character being a figure of fun, someone we are making fun of, a figure to empathize with, a figure to fear, all dependent. And you go, so the passage of internal monologue that we isolate as purple, depending on how it is packaged and transmitted to the reader, you can achieve a multitude of effects. And so the style of that one particular passage, you can pick it apart and go, oh yeah, this is purple, but it's deliberately so, and how it is framed. And that's when we get into this whole trying to consider extracts and part of narratives in connection to the whole, and not just because for ease of communication, we frequently just go, here's a passage that is an example of how this author writes. And we take it out of context. And that's where you get things like where people go, oh, I have taken 4 random paragraphs from this person's writing. Here are the number of sentences on average in one of their paragraphs. Here are the number of words on average in their sentences in these paragraphs. Therefore, here's an average of this thing. And so I can put it up against all of these other authors and tell you something about their style. You go, but you didn't note if that passage, the passages you took were dramatic passages, comedic passages, if they were action that was being described. If it was dialogue, how did you break that down? Oh, they were all descriptive. Well, is it descriptive what point of view was being used? What was the tone that was associated with it? And it's not that doing sort of big number crunching analysis can't yield interesting results, but they don't give conclusions in and of themselves, because they have to be taken in consideration with all of the other moving parts of what narrative is.
Yeah. So, and on a larger scale, then it seems we often have comments like, "Oh, I like a fast-paced book," or "I like transparent prose." So, if the discussion's actually style, then what the reader is responding to is a certain sort of style that speaks to them. It's moving quickly, so the pace is fast. And these are all descriptors of that particular style.
Yeah. And even with something like transparent prose that is used as a descriptor, and it's, you can go even further with that and go, well, what you generally mean by that is very basic descriptions of what is happening, that there's no interpretation, there's no poetic rendition of what is happening. It's keeping things very basic as a straightforward, this is what's happening on the page. And yet, depending on who the author is, even something that appears very transparent can have a lot of subtext worked into it because of a very careful choice in the words that are being used. So it can have all of the appearance of transparency, but at the same time, actually be highly poetic because each word is so loaded in terms of connotative meaning that there's an entire subtext being created that if you're used to that sort of surface level, it's just describing things, you completely miss. And so something that appears to be exactly the style that someone is talking about actually can be radically different. You could look at Hemingway sometimes, I think, for an example of this.
Yeah, Raymond Carver, Cormac McCarthy, absolutely. I was going to say something now I've forgotten, so continue.
But you think it, like one of the differences in sort of approaches to the different styles, and I've always gone back to Hemingway and Faulkner as in some respects they shared similarities, but in a lot of respects they were very different, because for me a lot of Faulkner's writing was much more evocative in terms of the sensuality of the words, but Hemingway seemed to be much more clipped, and I suppose it's quite common to call his writing masculine, whereas Faulkner then by contrast would be described as more feminine. But that's silly as a way of trying to describe it, because we're trying to find analogies to describe their different approaches to describing a scene and how they evoke certain things in their writing.
Yeah, but even there, of course, if you're looking for reasons for their stylistic flair or lack thereof, then you're back to resurrecting the artist, the author, because Hemingway's background in journalism and maybe Faulkner's immersion in the culture of the American South are definitive elements of what guided their style. So, but then of course, the thing is, I remember early on in the writing program, we had long discussions with the instructor on style. And one of the things that was kind of part of all this was this notion of genre expectation. And so there's, among readers, there's this idea of this is the style you need to have for this genre. And so that kind of pushes its way in. And so that even if you're talking about prose in a general term, with respect to distinguishing it from things that are not prose, you quickly move into sort of all the blending of these things, because so you've got poetic prose and you've got prose poems, and so everything's just sort of flowing into each other, because this is what artists do, right? Somebody decides on rules, and the first thing an artist will want to do is break them, and so they go out and do so. So I remember having a drama instructor. I don't know if you had him, Cam, at UVic, a guy named Lawrence Russell. You remember him?
I remember him, but I don't think I had him.
You didn't take any drama classes?
I don't think I took any from him anyway.
Yeah, he was a master pontificator, and so he once pronounced that the more outrageous the story you're telling in terms of deviating from reality, the simpler the language has to be. And so later on, I was thinking in terms of, well, when I'm going to move into fantasy, does that mean I have to completely make the prose transparent? Is that one of the genre expectations? And then I started looking around and saw, people like Guy Gabriel Kay, who are incredibly lyrical in their writing, very poetic, pulling it off without any issues. Donaldson's heavily Latinate style, you know. So you could see that the rules are broken all over the place, and it's all down to the intention of the artist, of the author.
Well, you're both fans of Glenn Cook's Black Company. And, you know, when you first start reading The Black Company, one of the things, particularly I think for a lot of modern fantasy readers, is being struck by the quite journalistic and straightforward nature of Croker's narration. And, you know, part of that, they go, oh, it goes to the characterization of who Croker is. But also it fits with the tradition of Vietnam War and Korean War fiction, that a lot of that was heavily journalistic. A lot of it was sort of grounded in that. And so
well, it was written by journalists.
Exactly. And vets who came back, but mimicked the style of what they saw in the other books of that ilk. And so taking that and putting it in a fantasy world about military fiction and going, but this is military fiction in our world appears this way. So if it's a fantasy setting, it's still going to have the same appearance. And so suddenly the mimicking of a mimetic genre expectation for Vietnam War fiction, but placing it in fantasy, creates a sort of very verisimilitudinous idea of the narration, that it feels grounded because of that. And that's a massive contrast to, you know, Donaldson's Latinate, almost archaic constructions.
Yeah. I remember when, because I don't know if you recall, Cam, but I was deeply immersed in all the Vietnam War literature when we were, you know, sharing a flat here in Victoria in our undergraduate writing program. And it was during that time that you handed me The Black Company. And I was floored by it because it was basically Vietnam War literature, but in a fantasy setting.
Yeah, we were both reading.
Yeah, it's a great example of breaking the so-called rules, because the rules are intended to be broken, I think. At least that's how an artist, or that's how a writer will view that. Whereas on the other side of things, if you're on the analytical side of literature, there is a great desire to establish set rules in terms of genre expectation, as AP well knows. So it ends up that artists are quite often fighting against the establishment of those rules. And I mean, the best example would be probably in visual art and painting and sculpture, that, you know, those rules were quite deliberately broken in terms of visual imagery, and became movements in and of themselves, whether it's cubism or surrealism or whatever, right? It's breaking away from established academy rules of what it is to produce a good painting. And so there's always a revolutionary aspect. Mm-hmm. And quite often it arrives long before the audience is there for it. And it takes a while for the audience to catch up.
So style and control, is this technique that you may like or dislike, why is it there? What's the author, artist, painter, what are they trying to do by using this particular technique or effect? What are they trying to do? So I think as a reader then, rather than say, well, I don't like this or I don't like that, they should be taking the time to reflect on, why is this here? Why am I encountering this particular effect or technique, whatever, at this point or in this book? And take a moment to actually think about the effects that the individual is trying to achieve by using it. And frankly, if you can't actually track one down, then maybe it is out of control, which does happen.
Yeah.
Well, authors are fallible humans. You're not gods. I hate to break it to you. Well, you're gods within your own worlds that you create. That's a different point. But I think one of the issues that we run into is because of the movement of literary criticism to away from authorial intent as the defining way to read something. The pendulum started swinging too hard, because people took death of the author to mean never consider authorial intent. And that's not what Death of the Author was an essay about. It was stop saying that if the author says X, it must be X. That must be placed in conversation with the reader understanding of a text. But because we basically jettisoned consideration of author intent, of any of those aspects, all we were left with was, well, how did it affect me? And so questions about why is the prose in a certain way? Why is it in a certain form? What is the author trying to communicate? Those questions get lost and aren't considered, because that is irrelevant to, did I like it? And we've placed the ego entirely centrally to the discussion of literature, where we recognize the importance of the reader in decoding the information, but we're ignoring the fact that the information was encoded by an author, and that the text is the communication device between these two points of author and reader. And really, to get the full picture of it, the full appreciation of what is happening in a text, that you need to consider both points. And an author, when they're creating it, can have an imagined audience, they can have an imagined reader. A reader, when reading, can have an imagined author, the person who did this, and they create an image. And that's, one of the reasons we talk about author rather than naming the person, that we recognize it's a construct. And it's always a negotiation between these 2 points. But because of Death of the Author, and because of the popular sort of misconception of it, we disconnected one full half of this discussion, which left it at, do I like it or don't I? Because that's the only thing that is definitive in this discussion.
Yeah. And it's funny because style is an interesting thing that I tackled really early on. Not entirely deliberately, but by reading a great variety of fiction when I was in the writing program, I made a point of sort of almost absorbing the style of whatever I was reading. And I remember almost every story that went in, that I put in through the workshop for the 3 years that I was doing that, was completely different stylistically from the stories that preceded it, because I was just trying them all out. And I look on my published body of work, and there's a multitude of styles on display there. So I always viewed style as simply one more tool in the toolbox. And you could put styles, you could actually alter styles in character voices within a single book. So, Krupp has a particular narrative style. Iskaro Pust has another narrative style. Crackpot Trail is completely different stylistically from anything else I've written. Willful Child, again, different style. Even The God Is Not Willing is different from the 10-book series stylistically.
How then do you pinpoint the difference between style and voice?
Well, voice, I think, is something we actually have less capability of really shifting or altering around. We have a basic voice, and that, I think, voice is defined by our primary interests. And those evolve, but they tend to evolve as kind of, occasional deviations from a particular mainstream. And so thematically, for example, you could probably unify all my books. Stylistically, I don't think you can. So there's a difference between those two things. So I don't know if, voice is difficult. It's something we could probably talk for hours on, because there's voice connected to character, for example, which you then, you're altering the voice on the text, in the text, based on the character's point of view. So voices, it's one of those really ephemeral aspects of narrative structure. And sometimes it's just going to appear whether you like it or not. But I mean, there are some authors who settle on a single style because it's highly successful, and they fuse it to their voice, and make a terrific career out of it. I mean, Stephen King comes to mind as somebody who has a particular style, and you will recognize every book.
I was going to talk about that. Some authors aren't concerned with experimenting with style. They've found what works for them. They found their niche, if you will. They found where they're comfortable, and they just, more power to them. They just go with it. And that's their choice. And if it works for them, it works. And I agree that voice, you can play with style, but it's much more difficult to play with. You're still in your voice. And so for me, each project, I try and I think about each project having a certain style requirements, and I experiment a bit with those, and I haven't and so we're talking about the author and the role of the author, but we're not talking about intentionality. I think in that it's not what is intended, it's what has ended up on the page, for good or bad, right? That's what we're talking about. And this is there, and it has you could talk about what its effects are. Those might not have been intended, but they're there.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that is very easy to see in much, much older work, where, let's say, an author comes from an older time period in which cultural attitudes to a certain thing are radically different to those cultural attitudes today. And we see that unconscious inclusion of it. And it's not conscious. They're not making a point of including it. It's part and parcel of how they were writing. They didn't intend it to make a statement about something. It's just what they included. But now when we read it from our vantage point in today, we look back on that and go, that was a deliberate inclusion insofar as the author included it and, intended it to be there. But what it communicated back then is different to what it communicates now. And I think that we can see radically different aspects of intentionality. Not only what did the author intend, so the author could have intended, I meant this greeting to be polite, but when today's audience reads what that author wrote, politeness does not come across because the words used in that greeting have acquired a completely different meaning and an understanding now of what those were. And we see that a lot with American writing in the 1800s compared to American writing today. Comparing something as simple as Mark Twain, looking at the use of certain language in Mark Twain that was not meant to be offensive, was never intended to be offensive when certain characters used it, but obviously was the same word being intentionally used to reflect it was being used offensively in that sense. But today, no, it's an offensive word. And so there's a whole aspect of different bits and pieces of what intentionality means and what is trying to be communicated by the author consciously, what is trying to be communicated by the author unconsciously, and what the reader now receives and interprets and attributes meaning to. And those things change. Those things aren't set in stone because readers change over time.
Yeah,
There's
but that.
Oh, sorry, Steve.
No, go ahead, Ken.
Oh, I was just going to say, again, voice maybe so. You could almost say it's the voice of that culture, and like each period almost has its voice, and like the Regency voice is different from the Victorian voice, or vice, and sort of there are, and these are cultural aspects that come with that period and with its voice. Maybe that's one contribution we can talk about, but that's what I was thinking. So,
Steve?
Yeah.
Steve?
Yeah, no, I would think that, but that's something that no author can predict, right? You don't know how language is going to evolve. You don't know the extent to which culture is going to veer in one direction or another. So, I mean, one of the advantages I think fantasy writers have is they can sort of separate themselves at least to some level, from the culture of the world in which they live, because they're creating a secondary world, or those who create a secondary world anyways, can kind of sort of disconnect. And but thinking about it, a lot of the cultural assumptions are carried over anyways, subconsciously. So, you know, if you're talking about Tolkien's real world experiences and the effect they've had on creating the secondary world, I mean, it's pretty mappable. It's all there. And I think in a lot of ways for the Malazan stuff, Cameron and I were writing in a counter position to our world. And so there's a connection there. There's a relationship there that's quite deliberate, but also unavoidable.
But also, I mean, like, even if you think of the D&D and GURPS aspect of it, which was setting out a game world, and all of the products were accompanied by books and pamphlets and how things were written, going and explain things in a certain way. So even the word choice used to describe the Drow and how the Drow were all described as a race set it out very distinctly from one particular narrative perspective. And yet, as soon as you start investigating it, something that the Forgotten Realms did much later on in the development of the Drow as a civilization was when, well, you can't just have a completely monolithic evil race. There has to be shades of grey within it. There have to be some good people. Like, it can't just be, oh, they're all Machiavellian mustache twirling villains. And nuance developed to make it more, and I hesitate to use this word, realistic, but to give it depth, to give it meaning, it needed to be more than two-dimensional. So if you start writing something inspired by the original construction, you end up writing against that maybe, or including aspects of it that you just sort of just accepted because you needed a two-dimensional sort of villain, and you went, oh, that's a good way to do it, and you maybe unconsciously picked that up. But in the genre, you had all of these different elements, not only of stuff in the genre that you were reading, say Tolkien or Cook or Donaldson or Terry Brooks or any of those authors, but you also had authors outside the genre. So Le Guin and her writing, the travel writing that Cam was researching. You have the classics that you read. You have the films that you went, oh, that's a really clever narrative idea, or I like how they did that tonally, and all these things are a melange that sort of come together. So you can see how influence from everywhere sort of creeps in. And that's what I'm always fascinated about then, is we recognize that for today's authors, but we look back and go, yeah, that's clearly a Victorian novel. You don't even have to look at the date it was published. You recognize it from stylistic aspects of the language, from sentence structure, the grammar, the choice of words, everything. You go, oh, that's clearly Victorian. Mm-hmm. That there's almost a Victorian style. And then within that, you go, but that Victorian style is different to that one. So these are two different authors. So when we talk about the prose, we can identify Victorian prose. And that seems to be wrapped up in style. But there has to be something that differentiates individual authors.
Yeah. Narrative structure and experimentation, I guess, is one of the, you think of Virginia Woolf, for example, in Stream of Consciousness writing. That just sort of broke down a lot of structural elements, even on the page. I know I wanted to find my copy of George MacDonald Fraser's The Pirates, because one of the, on the opening page of that, and he was a guy who could alter, change his style, depending on the book, similar to, say, Ian Banks, right? Ian M. Banks wrote very different style than Ian Banks. Same guy, but different content, different purpose. But so yeah, I was thinking in terms of, who was I just mentioning?
George.
Yeah, Fraser. Yeah, and I think somewhere on that opening page, there's the beginning of one of the longest run-on sentences you'll find anywhere, and it's just an absolute hoot, right? It's a blast, and you know he's fully conscious of what he's doing, and he creates this breathless pace running through this run-on sentence, and so in terms of prose, you know, you could look at it and say, well, oh no, that's a run-on sentence. That's terrible writing. That's, you know, that's bad. Sentence structure and all the rest. But if you look carefully at the sentence, actually it's grammatically correct. It just has a lot of clauses, like a lot of clauses. And
lawyers spend a lot of time learning how to do that.
Yeah. Well, again, purpose and intent, right? That dictates a lot of how the prose is shaped. And so if there's intentionality in what the author's up to, why wouldn't you just sort of jump on board and have fun, right? And run with it, as opposed to fighting against it. So.
Yeah, you've picked up that book. I presume you really ought to give it a chance, and rather than just sort of put it down. And the reader can, if they want, you know, it's their choice. If you give some patience to that judgment. If you encounter something that's new or different, and whoa, well, this is not what I'm used to. Well, you know, give it a chance. Maybe you'll like it. It's.
Well, I have to admit, when we studied a lot of the modernist experimentation with narrative and writing, there were a lot of those, let's generously call them short stories, that were just experiments in writing. And you just go, you know what? I'm glad I've experienced them. I can now tick these off the list as things that I genuinely enjoy reading. But it gives you an insight into what it is makes it work on the page for you. Because, you know, people talk about, oh, I'm a character reader. Can you read something without any characters in it? Because there are stories that have no discernible characters, and yet the story has character, or something is given character within it, and it performs the function of character without a character being present. Like, there's all sorts of weird and wonderful experiments with fiction that they went, the general accepted rule is to create X effect, you need to do Y. If you do Y, you create X. And they went, can I create X without Y? How can I do this? If I do Z, can I still create Y? Or does it create something else? And the playfulness with that, and I think some authors accidentally replicate something. But the great authors are those that know when they do it, they know what they are doing, and they know the effect that they are creating. And there's the ability then, when something isn't working within the text, that they go, I know what it is, I forgot that thing. And they can go back and fix it. But certain authors, I think, who think I am writing to a template, or I am just going to, I don't like that rule, so I'm not going to use it. And they don't understand why that rule was in place and what effect it was causing. And it worked with one narrative because of, for whatever reason, but doesn't work in another.
Yeah, I think Cam and I were really lucky. We had a writer instructor at University of Victoria in the undergraduate, and it was, I think, something of an unusual writing program in that it involved lecture courses as well, not just the workshops.
That's more of a traditional approach, I think.
Yeah, and so we had an entire course on narrative structure, and the whole purpose of that was the recognition that narrative structure is made up of a whole series of terms. So like voice, pace, sentence pattern, dialogue, exposition, sentence rhythm, diction level, tone, psychic distance, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not that it was a hard, fast rule, but it was almost a historical look at what works in storytelling and what are the components, what are the elements that we see appear again and again in a well-told story. And of course, that's like you know, the first 50% of the course. And then the rest of it is, let's look at examples of authors who break these rules. And one of the general conclusions you could come to at that point was, if you're going to remove one of these elements, point of view, dialogue, whatever, you have to replace it with something. And I remember reading a lot of, like AP says, a lot of these short fiction examples where, you know, it was a deliberate attempt to mess with narrative structure and break those rules. And you can read them once and you never have to read them again, because those rules survive for a reason. Why? Because they work, right? And they meet something in the desires of the reader that is important to that reader's sense of completion upon finishing a body of work that they've read. And quite often, if you pull those things out, the reader is left dissatisfied. So it's one of those things where being aware of them is you know, highly useful, especially as a writer editing your own work, because, you know, where something goes wrong, you can now deconstruct your work and find out where it went wrong and then fix it at that point. Mm-hmm. But if you're all seat of the pants instinctive writing, then find a good editor, because you're going to need it. You know, it's just the way it is. So
yeah.
And that's not to say that you can't have that artistic and make something absolutely brilliant, but the replicability of that is then going to be heavily dependent on lightning striking twice. And you know, some people are brilliant. Some people can just do it instinctively and not know anything about it. Mm-hmm. People like me, on the other hand, we've spent a very long time trying to figure out how it was that they got it to work, because it's fascinating.
Me too. Yeah, me too. Yeah, that's my obsession. It's always been my obsession. I look at stuff and I try to figure out how it works and why it works. You know, I'm right now I'm rereading the first time in like decades Don DeLillo's The Names, and I haven't gone back to look, but I think I'm pretty sure, and this is weird to say this, it's first person. But I don't recall seeing I used very often at all. And I'm wondering now if DeLillo was making, and it was experimenting in that, you know, can I write a first person narrative without ever using I? And I don't know if that's the case, but I think it's pretty damn close. It's pretty damn close. So I have to go back and look.
Yeah, it's been too long for me too. It's a long time ago.
It's interesting. It's a problematic book for me now, when it wasn't the first time around. I read it in like my mid-20s. And there is an issue where the voice is starting to, it's showing its contempt for all the characters a bit too much for me. I mean, it has contempt for itself as well as the main narrator. But and I think that's the only way you can get away with it, to have a narrator that is contemptuous of, you know, every character that's met in the book. I think if that character was not contemptuous of him or herself, it would be problematic. And so there's a nihilistic element that's running through the entire novel that I actually probably didn't even notice when I read it the first time.
Because that's something that's changed a lot in the sort of the style of books in the genre at the minute, like the sort of the modern genre. Now we've very much moved away from having a very strong, distinctive narrative voice associated with a specific narrative position. So a narrator who is commenting on things and sort of making snide remarks or being sarcastic about things, that we've moved very much away, because that was much more tied into, say, an oral storytelling tradition, where, you know, we were very used to someone telling us a story and then adding in those extra asides to go, you know, and they thought they were very intelligent. Clearly they were not. That those wonderful little digs that we used to get, but now it's, we want transparent prose that's meant to be sort of associated almost with a camera, a silent camera that is just witnessing. And we still refer to it as the telling of a story. But we can see how much of our language that we use to describe all of this is coming from a position where narrator was a person who was telling the story. And now we're struggling because, you know, when you talk to people about the narrator of this text, and they assume it's a person, and they spend a lot of time trying to work out who the person is.
Yeah.
As if that's going to explain everything. When you go, but in terms of narrator, it's a construct of a view for a lot of works.
Yeah, yeah. And look at, you know, the negative response of the latest Persuasion on television, right? Because there your main character is looking directly at you and commenting, right? So I think it may be shifting over, because I mean that was a fairly gutsy thing to do for that series. But
it was a very gutsy thing to do with Austen.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you think of Austen's work is social commentary. Austen's writing, yes, it's wry and it's dry and it's very, very clever, but it's all about snarky remarks about other people. That is the core humor of Austen, these witty asides and sharp digs at the people around her in this society. And you go, the modern equivalent of that is, you know, turn to camera and have a witty aside. It is an evocation of the Austinian model, but in a more modern sense. But keep the period trappings, and you collapse the distinction between then and now. You go, it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
And I actually, that was one aspect of it I thought was really, really good. Well, then again, I don't get hung up on fidelity to, oh, we must replicate the text in an adaptation. So how many Austen adaptations do we have to have before we admit, let's do something new, please? But different. We're talking about prose, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Prose.
Sorry.
That's a visual and spoken representation of a prose technique. You know, the witty aside and the commentary. They did it in film in a different manner, of course. And but again, we're back to, you know, what's the point? What's the purpose of that? And if it fits in the project, if it fits with the body and all these other aspects that we've been talking about, then it belongs, and it's not jarring. It's part and parcel of the whole project, and everything fits together. And then that's when you can start talking about, you know, success, or you know, did this work, and how many jobs is it accomplishing, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and it's funny because I use two characters to do that in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, right? Krupp and Iskra Pust. Their internal/externalized monologues are asides in many respects. They're commentary directly to the reader, even though at first glance they may not appear that way, at least with Pust, but they are, right? They're all about. Pust talks about subtext, and he just puts it out in the open, and or deception, or misdirection, and of course the whole act of what he's doing is itself misdirection. So it just keeps flowing into itself, right? So,
but also in the Malazan books as well, you do have moments, even though for a lot of it there is not a very clear narrator of the text. You do have moments where there's a narratorial comment that has been inserted, like, and that was the last that blah, blah, blah. Or, and they never thought of it again. You know, and these moments, this is an omniscient narrator coming in to tell you something in a text that to that point has had every appearance of being in limited third person.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
and again, not accidental, like quite deliberate, you know. So
that's the historical framing.
Yeah.
But this is one of the things that I love. It's like you sort of go, if I want to do that in a text, if I'm going to tell it generally in this way, but I want to have the opportunity to do that, you go, I set up a frame that I am allowed to then do that within my rules. But if I set up the rules that, no, this is going to be limited third and it's just going to be a camera, and then I break those to do narratorial inserts, you go, well, why am I breaking my own rules? That, to me, is bad writing. Setting up a rule that I then have to break. You go, that's bad writing. Because I think every author has where you think you need a narratorial insert, it might be the most blunt, direct, economical way to drop the information in. But I think every author in the world can look at the following 3 paragraphs and go, I know I can disperse that information. It'll fit into that without me having to do a direct narratorial insert. Okay, it takes a modicum of extra effort and it is not quite as efficient, but you can seamlessly work it in. Or you can just go, bugger, I'll just stick a narratorial insert in. Most people don't know when they're reading that I've just broken my own rules and it's lazy and I just can't be bothered fixing it. And I think that's very, very different to someone who specifically goes, that is a technique I might want to avail myself of. Therefore, I will set up different rules that allow it. And to me, those are actually two, although they end up looking very similar on the page to a reader, they're actually two fundamentally different mindsets for the author creating it. One author has thought ahead and gone, I need flexibility to do this, and this is within the rules I've set up. And the other goes, I don't care about the rules that I've set up. I'll just do that because my readers are not going to pick up on it. And those that do see it will go, oh, well, I needed that information, so it's fine. And to me, that's disrespect both to the reader and to the actual craft of writing. But, you know, I feel, obviously, I feel differently about this than a number of other readers.
Well, you know, like world building, you set up a set of rules and then you're supposed to follow them. Right? And if you start a novel and set up a certain set of rules for that novel or world or series or project, you should be following them. And because I think you set up a contract in a way, a contract between the writer and whoever happens to pick up the work, the reader, and you're agreeing sort of to this sort of set of ground rules that you will then proceed with. And you shouldn't shift the goalposts, so to speak, and mid if you should keep to those established rules. And I that's at least where I would come down.
Although obviously I do have sympathy. Sometimes it can just simply be a mistake. And, you know, like authors are just as fallible as any other human being on the planet. And sometimes it is a mistake. And you go, you know, you're not going to crucify an author over something small like that, unless it becomes something that they regularly do. And then you go, well, maybe this is just their style. But, you know, if someone is regularly going to do that, then why not include a reason for it in the frame instead of deliberately breaching the narrative each and every time? In terms of prose, like, how much do you think actual word choice is something that is important for the prose on the page? The actual choice of the specific words to describe something, the very deliberate choice of words, using run instead of sprint, something just as simple as that, like going right down to the nitty gritty.
Yeah, in fantasy, I think it's actually quite vital. In fantasy in particular, I think the language really has a large role to play. In other genres, maybe less so, but I think in fantasy in particular, I think it has quite an important role to play.
Well, why specifically fantasy?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's an expectation among readers that they're going to be treated to a diction or a style or a language that is slightly different from their day-to-day familiar old language.
Absence of colloquialism and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. For example, that's one mechanistic thing. And also what some writers and, you know, derisively and rightly so refer to as old-timey writing. Which can be done very coarsely and clumsily, or can be deployed in I think, a very effective manner.
Fair enough.
Well, my comment in support of Cam's assertion that it's really important in fantasy actually goes to the concept of world building, because I think a lot of people think of world building as, Well, I've got a map. I've got the cities on it. I know the names of the different cultures and races and what the magic is going to be like in the world. That's my world build. But in order to create that, choosing specific words is suddenly a way, even in the description of something basic, to evoke a sense of the world, to create that world, to build that world in the mind of the reader. And I think that is one of the reasons why both science fiction and fantasy sometimes, I think, are far more aware of very basic choices or word choice for even very basic concepts, because it adds to the creation of the immersive reality. Whereas in a mimetic fiction and a mimetic work, we can just rely on, well, it's another synonym for, and it's in terms of variance, but not about the evocation of the reality, not about an evocation of the story world.
Yeah, I guess I have to agree. I mean, historical fiction faces the same thing, right? You have to take your diction and begin eliminating a lot of common usage, because a lot of that usage is derived from technological advance, progression, and so it's a constant struggle between the fact that you have all this language at your disposal, but you can't use some of it. And I remember early on, I made the mistake, and you'll find that in Gardens of the Moon, I think only Gardens of the Moon, maybe a little bit of Deadhouse Gates, of talking, and it's a mistake in my mind, but maybe not to anybody else, because I think Cam has no issue with this, but minutes and hours, I got rid of them for the rest of the series.
Well, and the timeline as well, apparently.
Yeah, apparently. But I also got rid of yards or meters or whatever. I changed it to paces. Because I just didn't want those. I mean, as useful as they are, and they are really useful. So you're always trying to find other ways to convey the passage of time in an incremental fashion that people recognize. So I think I defaulted to heartbeats or breaths, that kind of thing. So yeah, there is a mindfulness that I think is required, that is not necessarily present in other genres, with the exception of historical fiction, which has to deal with the same thing.
And this actually goes to one of those things that we've previously talked about, which is the unconscious things that we carry over into these fictive reality. It is so natural to think in terms of minutes and hours, because that's just how we think about time: seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks. How many days in a week? There's 7. All of that. And then suddenly, when you're in a fantasy world, you go, "Is it? Is
it? Yeah.
Does that work? Do we still refer to minutes and hours? Like, how are we going to? Does that make sense for this fantasy world?"
Yeah.
And suddenly, it's quite jarring, because you're confronted with something that you thought of as this is an absolute base norm. No, it's not. It's one particular way of thinking about it.
Yeah,
it's cultural, and this is where we get into the sort of awful characterizations of out of other countries having a different attitude towards being on time or punctuality. Well, that's true. It's cultural. A task will take as long as it takes, and you can't break it down into certain set division. You're going back to another culture where time isn't being measured in the same way that you are measuring time. And you just get used to that. And then if you're entering into a fantasy world, again, yes, it's you can't talk about the same divisions, and tasks and things will take on a whole different, they'll take as long as they take, and someone says they'll be at a certain place. Well, you just have to wait, and eventually they'll show up.
but like one of the clear ones that crops up in a lot of fantasy writing: distances. Oh, how many leagues is it? And it's, let's choose an old form of distance measurement, because that's going to be more authentic for a fantasy world, rather than kilometers. Because as soon as you bring kilometers into a fantasy world, you have that jarring dissonance of, really?
Same distance.
But that's going to be culturally dependent. Like, if you refer to miles is still used as a common measurement in certain countries, kilometers used in other countries. Yeah, but no one uses leagues. Oh, it's a couple of furlongs.
Yeah, I definitely defaulted to leagues, 3-mile sets.
Yeah. Went back to the old Roman measurements.
Yeah, stadia and all the rest. Yeah.
But give it a different name. Also, ideas about and so we sort of veered off of prose, but this is in the prose. Yes, no answers. In a lot of cultures, it's very almost rude to give very simple yes, no attitudes to requests or things. Like, for example, the idea of hospitality. There are you can play with all these other all the cultural aspects, and then be mindful of that in the style and the prose and the representation. And it's not stated directly, but the reader, I think, will then, in a good fantasy world building, you'll get the impression that they're in a different place. And it's not stated, but it's by the conveyance of everyone's attitudes towards what's going on.
Yeah. And there's another aspect of diction as well, which is more mechanical, which is, I remember when I was writing for governments and corporations for that matter, there's a formula you use for establishing the diction level, which then relates to the education level of the audience and the intended audience. Because I worked for the Department of Immigration for a while, so I was working on the manuals that prospective immigrants receive prior to coming in the country. And so you needed, I think, a fourth grade level diction level. And so you applied this particular formula to what you wrote, and then you had to sort of start reducing your polysyllabic usage and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, in many respects, I suppose if you wanted the biggest audience in any genre, you would write YA and just call it adult fiction. Yeah. And that will give you the biggest audience possible.
I think that's been done, Steve.
This is called subtext. You're not supposed to actually raise that up.
Sorry,
I can't believe you did that.
I didn't name any names.
Yeah. Okay.
I did not name any names.
But this is the thing. But to consider even that question, that aspect, you have to go, well, the author has to make a decision about intended audience and reading comprehension levels of intended audience and potential audience. And you go, in which case, the author can't be dead. The author must be alive in that sense.
No kidding. Yes.
Because that's what we're looking at. So I think one of the things, when we talked earlier, we'd mentioned like transparent prose. The level of diction, the complexity of the language itself, the accessibility at certain levels of literacy is like a very important aspect of the prose, which is distinct to it being transparent. The actual literacy level that is being contemplated and utilized is not the same as it being transparent.
No.
So that I think is part of what maybe I was getting at with very specific selection of words and being careful with the type of words that are deployed and the complexity of sentences, the complexity of paragraphs. The simpler you make the word choice, the sentence structure, the paragraph structure, and the scene structure, the more you simplify that, the broader and more accessible you make your text. But at a certain point, there has to be, no, I need to stop here, because if I do it any further, I am losing the essence of the thing that I'm communicating. And I'm now writing a very different story, because a story you write for a 5-year-old is not going to be told the same way, or even particularly emphasize the same things from the same approach that you would to a 15-year-old or to a 25-year-old. That you approach those things differently according to the age of the audience or the intended audience.
Yeah, but it's amazing what text can do, right? Think of any parent out there who has read Winnie the Pooh to their child. Well, see, this is 5-year-old, diction level. And on the last book of that, you're blubbering as you're reading it to your child, and they're not getting it. But good grief, I mean, there is so much that's possible, regardless of diction levels.
Yeah, it can be done. It can be done really well, and be very evocative, or it could be done poorly, like any artistic choice.
And this is what I was saying. Like, all of these different things are related. As soon as you pick them out and you go, this is the rule about it, you go, well, there's this exception. And
always,
for me, that's what makes it interesting, because you don't just go, I've learned the 15 rules or the 50 rules or the 100 rules of writing, therefore I know them all. You go, every narrative is unique and deploys them uniquely. But there is something about, I think, the intended audience and how it's communicated. I think that is actually a very important thing. Or even writing something that flows well when read aloud, because having something that fits with the spoken word is not necessarily the same as, oh, well, that's good writing, because good writing can be something that was never intended to be read aloud. That you can have beautiful writing that doesn't fit breath patterns or breath emphasis or stresses. Right, you could write in iambic pentameter and you would have that wonderful da-da rhythm all the way through something. But if you're not intending for it to be read aloud, you would still pay attention to sentence rhythm and word rhythm within the sentence and those things.
Oh, I mean, it's one of the exercises that you get in creative writing programs is, you've written something, read it out loud, right? Prior to, ever showing it to anybody, read it out loud just to make sure that it feels seamless.
Well, I used to tell my students to do that with their essays, because that was something my lecturers used to say to me. I go, AP, have you tried reading this out loud? Yeah. And I would read it out loud and go, I'm an idiot. Let me just go and fix a couple of things.
Yep.
Because I knew in my head how it was meant to sound, but that wasn't what was on the page. And it is amazing how much you pick up when you read it aloud, and then you realize that you've actually added in 5 or 6 extra words to various parts of various sentences. You go, maybe I should put those on the page and not just assume that the other person is going to insert those words as well. But writing something to be read aloud that fits with that, and to have that oration, that is not always necessary for literature. But obviously something written in that style lends itself to, say, audiobook adaptation, where it is going to be performed as an oral work. Yeah. And something that is not that way, an audio performer, a voice actor, is going to have to work that much harder to bring life to it, because it's not written for that sort of verbalization.
But it's funny, because there's a thing there that sounds almost contradictory to that I'm about to say. It's actually contradictory to what you just said, which is that bad writing can be pulled off quite well by being read out loud.
Well, we have different standards. Splitting infinitives. Oh, you should never split in infinitives, because we wouldn't want to boldly go anywhere. But when we say it out loud, we're used to a certain informality. The linguistic register for spoken word is lower. So we can have sentence fragments. We can have multiple clauses that don't quite, subject-object confusion and all sorts of stuff going all out the window. Because if someone is speaking it, we're used to partial sentences. We're used to run-on sentences. Like, anyone trying to make a transcript of what I say, I am so sorry. Because none of it is a formal written sort of pronouncement. I ramble. I have broken things. I tail off. I suddenly skip on to a different point without finishing the previous one. And if that was all written down, it would be terrible writing, but highly representative of an oral performance.
It's good exercise for writers to sit in a cafe and try to transcribe the conversation going on the table next to you.
Good for
highly immoral, but do it anyways.
Yeah, learning how to represent dialogue is
Yeah.
another thing you can, how do people actually, are they actually talking? But at AP, I'm going to have to beg off. Today is quite a busy time for us. So it's been wonderful, and thank you so much. But it's 1 here at my time, and we've got to go run off and do some stuff.
Okay.
Oh, yeah,
well,
probably what? Carpentry, right? Carpentry.
carpentry on the barbecue.
Yeah, on the barbecue.
Well, thank you both for joining me. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for this discussion. And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.
Oh, wait. Before you go, Cam, I have maps. You don't have them.
Maps must be sent.
Okay, I'll send them. Don't worry.
Bye, everyone.